Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video in a new location. And today I'm going to be sharing with you all the books I finished in both June and July. We took a little bit of a bookish video break while I moved across the country, but I'm excited to be back. It feels like it's been forever since we talked about books here. So of course, let me know in the comments down below, what are the best books that you read in the past 2 months? What are your favorites? If you have any recommendations for me, I am always looking for new favorites. And as always, my bookish videos have chapters. So if you hover over the timeline or check out the description box, you can see the timestamps for different sections of this video. So if you want to skip around, if you want to start with a specific book, or if you'd rather skip the stats and come back to them at the end, that is all up to you. Those are there for you to use, if you so wish. Before I hop into it, I want to talk about today's video sponsor, Ana Luisa. I have worked with them in the past and just adore their brand, adore their jewelry, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to partner with them again. For those of you who are constantly asking me where my jewelry is from, pretty much every piece I wear in every video is from Ana Luisa, except for my wedding and engagement rings. So when in doubt, assume it's from Ana Luisa. My favorite thing about Ana Luisa as a brand, outside of the fact that they make beautiful jewelry that I want to own and wear, is their focus on sustainability. That is something that's so important to me that I talk about again and again on various social platforms. It's something that I think we all need to be focusing more on, and I really appreciate the way that they put sustainability first in everything that they do. To minimize waste, Ana Luisa releases limited batches of their jewelry each week, and they only use recycled materials for their jewelry, both from electronic components and from previously worn jewelry. And all of their diamonds are lab-grown, meaning they don't require any mining. They are also the first direct-to-consumer jewelry brand to become completely carbon neutral. Not only is Ana Luisa committed to sustainability, but they also want to produce affordable quality jewelry. Their pieces start at just $39, and right now they are having their summer sale. So click the link in the description box to shop and get 20% off beautiful, sustainable jewelry from Ana Luisa. Again, that's 20% off, so click the link in the description box to shop the sale. Thank you so much to Ana Luisa for sponsoring this video and for doing all that you do. And with that, let's hop in to talking about all things books. So now, getting into the stats first. I did combine the stats from June and July. I just thought it would be easier for my brain. So total books read in June and July was 14, 4 in June and 10 in July. Total pages read was 5,287. The longest book I read was The Priory of the Orange Tree, which was 848 pages. And the shortest book was Fired Up About Reproductive Rights, coming in at 140. And I did DNF one book, which I'll get to later. As for the age demographic, 57.1% were adult books and 42.9% were YA. As for genre, most of the books I read in the last 2 months were romance, which is very unusual for me. I read 4 romance books. My next most read genre was science fiction, which is not surprising since I love sci-fi. I read 3 sci-fi books. Then next we have nonfiction and thriller tied at 2 books each. And then I read 1 fantasy, 1 horror, and 1 memoir. As for the format I consumed these books in, they were almost entirely audiobooks because I love audiobooks. I always have an audiobook going, if not a couple audiobooks going. And with moving, I spent a lot of time in the car, so audiobooks were just perfect for that. So 78.6% of the books I read were in audiobook form, and then 14.3% I read as physical books, and 7.1% were ebooks. As for my rating, I had kind of a spread across all of the ratings in the last 2 months. I had 1 1-star read, 2 2-star reads, 1 3-star read, 4 4-star reads, and 6 5-star reads. which is just amazing. As for LGBTQIA plus rep, so 78.6% of the books I read in the last 2 months had LGBTQIA plus representation in some form, and the vast majority of those were focusing on LGBTQIA plus stories where the main characters were part of the community, and 21.4% of the books I read did not have LGBTQIA plus rep. As for the year published, most of the books I read were new releases from 2021. So 7 2021 releases, 1 from 2020, 4 from 2019, 1 from 2017, and 1 from 2000. As for how I got my books, most of them were from the library at 28.6%, and this was through the Libby app on my phone. 21.4% were from Scribd. 14.3% were owned in physical form. 14.3% were from Libro FM, and then 7.1% were from NetGalley, Kindle, and Audible, respectively. So as for authors' identity over the last 2 months, 71.4% were white, 21.4% were South Asian, and 7.1% were Black. 78.6% were female, 14.3% were male, and 7.1% were non-binary. As for authors' nationality, most of them were American, so 8 authors were American, 2 were British, and then 1 was Australian, 1 was from Bangladesh, 1 was Canadian, and 1 was from Pakistan. So those were my stats for the last 2 months, and now without further ado, let's jump into talking about the books I finished in June. So as I mentioned, I only finished 4 books in June. So the first book I finished was One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. One Last Stop was provided to me as an ALC from Libro FM. Libro FM is a service where you can get audiobooks and support your local bookshops at the same time, which is really amazing. And Libro FM offers me some influencer copies every month in exchange for me talking about them. So definitely check out Libro FM. They'll be linked down below. They're an awesome service. I love using them to listen to audiobooks. And One Last Stop is the story of August, who is a bisexual woman who just moved to New York. And one day while riding the subway, she meets Jane, who she is immediately interested in. And it turns out that Jane actually time traveled from the 70s and is stuck on the subway. So this book is kind of a strange combo of sci-fi, history of the gay rights movement, romance, found family, and detective novel. And while that sounds really chaotic, it's kind of awesome. I really, really enjoyed this book. I was just immediately pulled in. I really cared about August. And as we continued to meet more characters, I just loved every single one. Jane is incredible. I adore her. I really loved that she pulled in the history of the gay rights movement through talking about her experiences in the 70s as an out lesbian. I really feel like that added a lot of depth to the story. And all of the other characters, all of August's roommates, are amazing. I love Nico, who is a trans character. His partner, Mila, is a queer Black woman, and she is like the best. She just seems like she could become anyone's best friend in 5 seconds and is so genuine and loving and also super smart. And I just want her to be my best friend, basically. So many lovely moments. I loved the found family aspect of this story. I loved the central romance. I thought it was adorable. I thought their connection was really sweet. I just enjoyed myself. I thought it was great. There is a moment where August and Jane are talking about Jane's experiences in the 70s and how she was struggling with racism and homophobia. And August does say something along the lines of, you know, things aren't really like that anymore, or things have gotten better since then. And that definitely stood out to me as a little strange in the moment. And the more distance I have from reading it, the more that I feel weird about that part. I think there could have been a lot more nuance, because on the one hand, yes, things are overall better now than they were in the 70s in a lot of ways, especially for the LGBTQIA plus community, but there's still such a long way to go. And especially with Jane being Asian and the racism we've seen toward Asian people, especially East Asian, especially Chinese people in the last year and a half because of the current global situation, it just doesn't feel right to have someone sort of reassure her that she's not going to have to deal with racism or homophobia anymore when that's sadly not the case. So I did want to put that out there, that that is in there. I think it could have used more detail and nuance there. But outside of that moment, I really loved the book. I thought it was really great. I know some people have problems with there being explicit scenes on a subway. If you're not into the idea of people getting it on in a subway, this is not the book for you. But otherwise, if you don't mind that, it is fiction after all, then I would highly recommend. I thought it was great. The next book I finished in June was To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. And this is a book that I've read before. It's a sci-fi novella, and I read it as a book club selection actually in 2020 and just adored it. And ever since I finished it, I've been poking my husband, asking him when we can listen to the audiobook together because I knew he would love it. We're sci-fi nerds together, but he's not a huge reader, so I really wanted us to listen to it together. And we ended up listening to it on our road trip as we were moving across the country, and he loved it just as much as I did, which I was very excited about. I was nervous that I'd hyped it up too much and that he wasn't going to love it. I gave it 5 stars the first time. I would give it 5 stars again. It's just wonderful. It's so atmospheric. The characters are awesome. There's varied LGBTQIA plus representation. There's a polyamorous relationship that is really beautiful. The alien worlds are so intricate and interesting. The aliens themselves are really imaginative. And I feel like this audiobook especially is just so well done. You can really imagine what's happening. I felt like there was a whole movie in my head while listening to it. And it was just 10 out of 10. Would highly recommend. If you haven't taken my recommendation to check out Becky Chambers yet, and you like sci-fi, I don't know what you're doing. Get on it. She's amazing. The next book I finished in June was We Have Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir by Samra Habib. And I really enjoyed this. This is the story of Samra as she comes to terms with her sexuality, growing up in Pakistan and then moving to North America, and just her process of coming to terms with her identity and trying to marry her sexuality and being queer with her Muslim identity. And I felt like it was really beautifully written. I really felt connected to Samra. It starts when she's young. There is some intense content, some potentially triggering content, so check out trigger content warnings if you have any that you're concerned about. It does get dark. I really enjoyed spending time with Samra. I enjoyed hearing her story. I found it very insightful. I will say I felt it was maybe a bit short. There were some parts that were kind of skimmed over or just went by kind of quickly, and I felt a little lost at different times. And obviously it's hard with a memoir, and there's no obligation just because Samra wants to tell her story that she has to go into great detail in every moment of her life. But there definitely were some aspects that felt like they were important to her story, for her coming into her own and growing into a fully realized human, that we just really quickly skimmed over, that I felt was a little bit jarring. And the last book I finished in June was Cool for the Summer by Dahlia Adler. And this is the story of our main character, Lara, who has a fun summer fling with another girl and starts to kind of question her sexuality, and then comes back to school, and the boy that she's had a crush on for forever is all of a sudden interested in her. And she gets really excited about that and starts pursuing a relationship with him. And then it turns out that her summer fling has started going to their school. And she has this dilemma. Should she go for this girl? Should she go for this boy? And is coming to terms with her sexuality as a bisexual human. So sadly, this one did not work for me. I gave it 2 stars. I just kind of hated all the characters. And some of this might be, again, I bring this up all the time, but I'm not a young adult. Well, I am sort of, but I'm approaching 30. I'm about to turn 29. I am a full adult. So sometimes when I read stories that are YA, I get really hung up on the immaturity of the characters, which is just, to be expected, especially a high school story, as people are kind of navigating early relationships. But I definitely find myself, some YA is fine and it doesn't bother me at all. But sometimes the immaturity is just really grating, and I feel like in this book that was the case. I just found our main character very irritating. She also wasn't the nicest person. And then the love interests were both a little one-dimensional and kind of boring and not the most likable people. So I just felt like I wasn't really rooting for any side of the triangle. I just didn't really care who she ended up with. And just found it kind of meh. So 2 stars for it. I didn't hate it or anything. It was fine, but Nothing special. Okay, so now on to my July reads. I'm going to start with my one DNF from this past month. And this was Dial A for Aunties by Jessie K. Sutanto. And this one, I guess the problem was just a mismatch between my expectations and what the book actually is. Though again, I'm only speaking to the first couple chapters. But this is sort of like a slapsticky, farcical comedy dealing with an accidental death, basically. So there's an accidental death at the beginning, and then our main character enlists her many aunties to help her basically cover it up. So I knew that going into it, but I think my problem was that the accidental death itself was it just didn't make any sense. Like, the death, fine, okay, that, sure, that could happen. But the fact that our main character doesn't just immediately call the police in this situation makes zero sense to me. And the whole book relies on her making that decision and then needing to cover it up, but she didn't need to cover it up. And I just don't understand why she didn't call the cops right away. So I just felt myself getting stuck on that point as it continued, and it started to get into, I guess, the main gist of the story. And she was freaking out and talking about they have to cover this up, and everyone's kind of getting on board with that plan. I know it's fiction, but I couldn't get over that hump. I just thought, I can't read this whole book knowing that she easily could have and should have called the police when what happened, and then none of this book would have had to take place. But she didn't for no discernible reason, and now this book is happening. So I decided to DNF it because I had a feeling that if I continued to read it, it would turn into a hate read, which can be fun sometimes. And y'all know I do sometimes enjoy a good rant, but I just wasn't in the mood. So I decided to DNF it. It seems like lots of people have enjoyed it and thought it was fun, so that's cool. If that sounds fun to you, then check it out. I don't want to dissuade anyone from reading it if you have an interest. I think the setup for me just kind of was a sticking point, So on to the first book that I did actually finish in July, which was The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. And this is the fourth and final installment in the Wayfarers series. So I loved this. I have loved this series so much. The first book in the series was the first Becky Chambers book I ever read, and I immediately became one of her number one fans. I just adored it so much. And each installment in the series has been so wonderful. I will say that the last one, the third book, was my least favorite, but I'm pretty sure I still gave it 4 stars. I didn't dislike it by any means. It just wasn't quite as special as the other installments. But this fourth one was just wonderful. Yet again, I gave it 5 stars. I think my favorite is either the first or second one. I think I have to reread to be sure, but I'm happy to reread it, so that's no problem. But I really did like this fourth one. And for anyone who hasn't read this series, the series isn't a traditional linear series with the same cast of characters. Each book has its own thing going, but they're all within the same world. And there are occasionally characters that show up from one book in another. So there was one character that we saw in the first book that showed up in this fourth book, but it's not the same characters over and over again. So I know some people hate that, but while I am sad each time as a book ends, knowing that I probably won't be able to read about these characters that I fell in love with again, I do really like knowing that the next book is going to be a whole different group of people that I get to meet and fall in love with within this world that I enjoy so much. Although this one was extra sad at the end because it is the last book in the series. And I really hope that Becky Chambers decides to continue to write more stories within this world at a later date, because I would just gobble them up like nobody's business. So again, if you've been on the fence about Becky Chambers and you're a sci-fi fan, or even if you're not a sci-fi fan usually, but you like wholesome found family, lots of LGBTQIA plus representation, lovely world building, complex relationships, all of those good things, I would highly recommend this series, as well as the novella I mentioned in the June portion, which is To Be Taught a Fortunate. Yeah, all of her stuff is amazing. And I'm really excited to read the first book in her new series soon. Hopefully I'll get to it in August. The next book I finished in July was The Weight of the Stars by Kay Ancrum. And this is another sci-fi novel. This one is a YA sapphic romance with a sci-fi twist. And it was just lovely. There was so much varied representation in this book, both racially and with the sexual identities of the characters. There was a lot of LGBTQA plus rep. We had our central sapphic romance, but we also had a bisexual character. We also had representation of a polyamorous relationship. And I felt all the representation was approached in a really respectful way. And the story itself was really interesting and engaging. I really felt pulled in. The world building was really well done, in my opinion. And I just fell in love with our main characters. I was really rooting for them. It's a bit of a enemies to lovers situation. And actually, both of the main characters are kind of that grumpy but have a soft spot for you trope. So they were both kind of tough, grumpy characters, but they had a soft spot for each other and had that enemies to lovers trajectory, and it was really well done. I thought it was really, really cute. There is definitely some darker content here, or, exploration of more difficult subject matter, so definitely check out the trigger content warnings if you're concerned about that. But I definitely think this book is worth your time. It has a very poetic quality to it at times. It has a lot to say about humanity and existence and priorities, what matters to us as humans, what we focus on, what we need as human beings, and the universe at large and our place in it. I just thought it was very beautiful. I feel like I'm going to get emotional talking about it. The ending made me just break apart. Maybe memories of that are coming back. But I would highly recommend. I thought this was really beautiful, and I need to read more by Kay Ancrum, because this is my first book by this author, and it was amazing. So, highly recommend. The next book I finished in July, finally, was House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. And this book, I've been reading this book for so long. I literally started it in November or October of 2020, one of those. Has it ever taken me so long to read a book? I don't know. This book is a trip and a half. I would highly recommend it. It is horror. There is some graphic content. There's graphic sexual content, graphic violence. There's some pretty dark and difficult subject matter. So again, check out those trigger content warnings. I actually had to do 2 slides for the book card for this one because there were so many trigger warnings to include. It is quite a chunky one, and there's a lot that goes on, so there's a lot to be aware of, and I tried to think of as many possible content warnings I could to include. But if you're up for a challenge, if you're up for something that really takes a lot of commitment to read, and you like books that are their own kind of brand of weird and wonderful, would highly recommend. It is horror, so keep that in mind. It is definitely scary at times. It definitely kind of burrows its way into your brain. I've had lots of dreams inspired by this book since I started reading it, but it definitely doesn't feel like a traditional horror by any means. It's one of the most unique books I've ever read. I mean, the format is ridiculous. If you know anything about this book, you will know that already. But there are a huge amount of footnotes that you kind of have to keep track of. There's a bunch of appendices and letters and collages, pictures, poems that are kind of attached. There is some really cool formatting throughout the book, which is part of why I would highly recommend the physical version. I don't even know if there's an audiobook, but I wouldn't recommend it if it did exist, because I think that a huge part of this book's merit is in the way that the format has been so masterfully connected to the story. It really serves the story. So I would definitely recommend. The format is just really interesting. Let me find another cool page to show you. There are so many, so I don't know how much you can see from over there, but yeah, it's pretty cool. And here's a cool one too. It's sort of a story within a story within a story, because the main text is basically an analysis of a fictional documentary. So we have the documentary, and then we have the analysis of the documentary, and then there's also a third story with the footnotes from the character who is compiling the analysis of the documentary, and his footnotes add to that analysis and also tell his own story. So there's a lot of layers to it. I loved all three. I really enjoyed the documentary itself. I wish someone would make this documentary, like make a fictional film of the documentary, because I would totally watch it. I feel like it would be terrifying and amazing. But I also loved the analysis of it, and it is kind of meta and funny to read a really long analysis of a documentary that doesn't exist. But the analysis was really interesting, and as you can see, well, I don't know how well you can see, but I have a bunch of book darts marking almost every page, it feels like, because there were just so many interesting insights that are not just relevant to this fictional documentary and to this narrative of this book as a whole, but also just to life in general. There were some really interesting nuggets of wisdom in there that made me want to do more research or do more reading. So there's a lot in here, and it definitely takes commitment. You have to hop back and forth between footnotes and back to an appendix and back to a footnote, and go aside and read, 25 letters from a character that seems completely unrelated to the story and then jump back into it. But all of those little, side journeys have value within themselves and add a lot, in my opinion, to the story as a whole. And they're just all layers and parts of the same story. It seems like some people who read it found the footnotes story, which was sort of Johnny's storyline, not as interesting. I know that Kayla from Books and Lala read this book and said she ended up just skipping the footnotes from Johnny to get through it. And that just makes me sad because I actually really love Johnny. I mean, he's not a very likable character. He makes a lot of questionable decisions, but I kind of understand where he's coming from. He had a really, really rough childhood and life, and his present isn't great either. He's got a lot going on. And I just feel like his story mirrors the narrative within the documentary so well. It really enhances the experience, and it also just adds to that feeling you get as a reader of being really sucked in, because that's what's happening to Johnny. Johnny is like us. He's reading this analysis of the documentary and he's getting really pulled in, and he's feeling his whole life start to revolve around this story. He's becoming obsessed, and it's really impacting his mental health and his ability to function as a human in his own life. And it just really kind of mirrors the way that we as readers start to feel a little obsessed, because there's something about like flipping quickly to the back to read a footnote and flipping back and following a weird narrative and trying to figure out the clues on this page or that page. And you look up a forum to see if anyone else figured out why every E was missing on page 98 or whatever, like there's so many theories out there about this. And you start to feel a little obsessive about it. And I feel like Johnny's story just really kind of amplifies that feeling, because you start to see yourself in him, and he gets so pulled in, and it really takes over his life in such an extreme way that you're like, oh my God, is this going to happen to me? And sort of adds to that horror. Like, you become a character in the story. It's not just the documentary and the analysis and Johnny's commentary on the analysis and the documentary, but then you become that fourth story, sort of. I feel like I'm getting... If you don't know anything about this book, I probably sound a little off my rocker here, but it's amazing. It was written in 2000, so there are some things that are outdated in here, but I think it has a lot of value. This is the most unique and interesting horror novel I've ever read. And it really feels like it transcends the genre. I say that not as a huge horror reader, so don't come for me, but this is, sort of unlike anything I've ever read of any genre. And I would highly recommend it. Again, physical copy is the only way to go. Lots of Post-its or book darts or a highlighter and a pencil, and give yourself time and give yourself breaks when you need them, because it's intense, but very worth your time. I give it 5 stars. And I might start rereading it right away, because I just feel like there's a lot more in there than I got, even though I really tried to pay attention and pick up as much as possible, and I want to get all of the nuance. So, amazing. Highly recommend. Whew, I had to take a second and catch my breath. I got too excited talking about talking about House of Leaves. Okay, so the next book I finished in July was What's Your Pronoun? Beyond He and She by Dennis Barron. And this is basically just a history of English speakers and the English language and our relationship to a single person gender neutral pronoun. And essentially Dennis Barron is going into this saying, you know, there's this debate right now about the use of they, them to refer to a single person without specifying gender. And people get very up in arms saying that it's not grammatically correct. And he sort of squashes that immediately and just explains why they, them is in fact grammatically correct to be used for an individual person, and people use it all the time, and that's not really a valid argument. But then he also goes into the history of the way that we've seen they, them and used it, you know, over the centuries in the English language. He talks about other neutral pronouns that have kind of popped up and then not really been used and sort of fallen to the wayside. And I appreciated that he really basically started the book by saying they, them is the answer to this debate. It's been here all along. Let's use what we have. Come on, people, get with the program. And went through the whole book. And then at the end came back to, okay, so we understand now. They, them. It's the answer. It's what we've been looking for. Let's use it. And I just really enjoyed that. I thought it was kind of funny that it was very clear from the beginning kind of where we were going to end up, but it was still an interesting journey to get some of that historical context. And he also goes on a little bit of a side jaunt into exploring generic he and why generic he has never actually been a thing, and that he has never been truly generic and has never truly included everyone. And I enjoyed that because nothing bothers me more than the use of the generic he. It just never feels like it really truly includes everyone, or it only selectively includes everyone. And he gives many examples of this. One of my favorites was just showing how, you know, generic he, especially in legislation, applies to everyone in certain contexts. So if, you know, there are laws about jail time, if they use the generic he, then that applies to everyone. So women, you know, still have to go to jail and these laws still apply to them. But when it's in the context of who gets to practice law or who gets to run for office or who gets to vote, then all of a sudden the generic he is not a thing. And when they say he, they only mean men. And it's just, the hypocrisy is glaring. And I appreciated that he delved into that because it's just one of those pet peeves of mine. And it's definitely been an issue through history, that sort of double standard. When it's he meaning just men, or when it's a generic he meaning apparently everyone. And who gets to decide when it's generic and when it's not? Surprise, surprise, it's men. Shocker. So anyway, I enjoyed that side jaunt as well. I gave it 3 stars, not because I didn't enjoy it or find it informative or interesting. I just felt like it could have gone deeper on the social implication side. It did touch a little bit on how the pronoun debate impacts non-binary people and gender fluid people who are asking for accommodation and the use of their proper pronouns. But I just felt like he could have gone deeper and could have maybe interviewed some people or, you know, collaborated with someone who had a little bit more knowledge on that social side or gender theory side. Just because obviously this book came out when it did in 2020 because we've been having so many more conversations about gender neutral pronouns, pronouns in general. Actually, that just makes me think of people who get really mad about the pronoun debate and then say like they don't have pronouns and they don't want people to use pronouns for them and stuff. Like they don't really understand what pronouns are, or that they have pronouns, or they'll use pronouns for themselves within the sentence of them talking about how pronouns are unnecessary. And it's just like, you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Anyway, that's a going off on a tangent. But anyway, but I just feel like clearly this book was published now because it's relevant now, but it's not just relevant as an intellectual debate about the use of language and grammar rules. It's much deeper than that. People aren't angry about it the way people get annoyed about misuse of apostrophes. It's very different because it's about people and their identities and that prejudice towards people who don't fit into a gender binary. And there's so much more depth and nuance nuance there. It's so much more complex. So I do wish that there had been a little bit more of an exploration into that social side, into the people involved, into why people are getting so angry about it, especially right now, because obviously this book shows that this has been a debate for a long time, even within different social contexts and different social climates. But right now we're having this discussion because people are up in arms about any gender that doesn't fit their very binary view of what gender should be. And I think it's important that any work that is sort of capitalizing on this moment in time also take the time to address that human aspect and the hatred and oppression that's being put on people who don't fit within a gender binary. I just think that that's an important aspect of it that was a little bit brushed under the rug. And as much as what was included was very interesting, I just felt like that was a pretty glaring omission. The next book I finished in July was The Project by Courtney Summers. And this is a thriller or a mystery where our main character is working for a journalist and she's trying to get him to do a story exposing this cult that has taken in her sister. I have a lot of feelings about this and also simultaneously not enough feelings. So this is NXIVM. If you know anything about NXIVM, it's a cult, a real life cult, and it has had very recent publicized trials of the cult leader and some of the other kind of big time players within it. There have been some web series and documentaries out about it. And this cult in this story is very clearly based on NXIVM and pulls a lot of those aspects, though it does amp it up and add a little more murder. Just, because it's fiction, so of course it does. And on the one hand, I understand because the NXIVM story is really interesting and kind of baffling and very fascinating to think about the psychology of what's going on there. But I guess just because I have listened to a podcast about NXIVM, I have watched 2 separate documentary series on it and kept up a little bit with the trials that have been going on. So I'm very aware of the reality of the real cult that this is based on. It just feels kind of weird to read fiction about it and to read some of these aspects of the real cult that are being amplified and kind of played up in a fictional context just is a little off-putting to me. And I didn't know going into this that this book was so heavily based on NXIVM. I'm not sure if I would have read it if I knew that. So that was kind of weird for me. But if you don't know anything about NXIVM, then that won't be a factor for you. And even if you do, that might not bother you the way it did me. It just kind of was off-putting. And maybe because I know so much about the real cult, I felt myself being pulled out of the story every time they mentioned something that clearly was pulled from NXIVM, because I just started thinking about the real cult. And there were a couple times that I started getting the real one mixed up with the fictional one, which was confusing. So anyway, there was that aspect. But then outside of that, I just felt that the logic in the story and the characters were a bit lacking. I did not like our main character at all. She was very entitled, not a very nice person, and her decisions made no sense. So that's what I'll say about her. And then a lot of the other characters as well were just kind of flat. Probably the character I found the most interesting was our main character's sister, B, who was in the cult, but we didn't see really enough of her, in my opinion. I think I would have preferred this book if it was from her perspective, because I did find her a little more interesting and also a little more likable. She had a few more redeeming qualities. But yeah, it was just a little predictable. The pacing at the end was a bit strange. Again, some of the decisions made by our main character made zero sense. So yeah, it just didn't work for me. I gave it 2 stars. I didn't hate it. It just sort of fell flat, The next book I finished in July was Fired Up About Reproductive Rights by Jane Kirby. And this was provided to me by NetGalley for review. And this is part of a series, the Fired Up series, which are sort of primers on different subjects. So there's reproductive rights, there's one on consent, there's one about capitalism, and they're for young people, sort of teens, to introduce them to various subjects. And Jane Kirby herself is Canadian, so a lot of this included facts about Canadian laws and kind of came from a Canadian perspective, which was fun to read as a Canadian myself, because a lot of the books I read are from an American perspective. And I think this book was quite well done. I would definitely recommend it to teens or preteens or to parents of preteens and teens. I think it is really great for what it's meant for, which is that primer, that introduction to reproductive rights as a whole, to kind of different aspects of how that impacts people of all genders within our society, but especially people with uteruses, and sort of the laws involved, the social impacts involved, and some of the history there, and how there's an intersection there between oppression based on race or religion or gender, or how reproductive rights are taken away based on those things. There is that intersection there, and that was explored as well. So I definitely think that this is beneficial to young people who don't know a lot about this. It definitely covered a lot of ground that I already know as an almost 29-year-old woman. I would say I was given the audio copy and it was fine, but I would definitely recommend a physical copy or an ebook. I don't think that the format of this book makes much sense in audiobook format, and I didn't really enjoy listening to this particular narrator, so keep that in mind. If you are to read this, I would recommend reading it with your eyeballs and not your ears, if that is an option for you. While I really appreciated the highlighting of the intersection between reproductive rights and various oppressions, including the specific focus on the way that residential schools impeded upon reproductive rights of Indigenous children, including forced sterilization. And I think that that's really important, and I really appreciate that that was included and was heavily focused on. I do wish that Kirby had spent more time talking in a bit of a more inclusive way about reproductive rights and being more inclusive in her language when talking about people who are impacted by laws around abortion, for example. There was a little bit of a mention of people who aren't women who still have uteruses and might be impacted, but it did feel a little bit like an afterthought or a footnote, and she does address the fact that she is mostly coming at this from the perspective of a cisgender woman and as a white woman. But I do think with the amount of time she spent trying to include the intersection between race and reproductive rights, that she could have also spent time being a bit more inclusive towards trans people and non-binary people, gender fluid people who may still have uteruses and may still be impacted by these laws that she's discussing and this legislation around our reproductive health. I definitely think it's beneficial for preteens or teens. I would have loved to be able to read this book when I was 13 years old, but I think that there are some areas where it could improve. Okay, so next up we have Hani and Ishu's Guide to Fake Dating by Adiba Jaigirdar. And this was a really fun book. This is a YA sapphic romance between two South Asian characters in high school. And it's a little bit of a combo of fake dating and also enemies to lovers. And I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was really sweet. And I really liked the way that Hani, who is the bisexual character, was portrayed and the way that biphobia was handled. I thought that was really well done. And this book also did a really good job of exploring parental relationships, especially more toxic ones, the really intense pressure that teenagers can feel when it comes to academic achievement and sort of setting up their lives for the future, as well as racism and stereotypes and struggling to fit in as a person of color within a mostly white community, as well as fitting in as someone who's part of the LGBTQIA plus community within a heteronormative world. So I thought this book was really well done. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The one drawback, and the reason why I gave it 4 stars instead of 5, was just that the characters came across to me quite young for their age. They were supposed to be, I guess, around 17, but they definitely read more like 14, maybe. And as I mentioned earlier, one of my struggles with YA in general is just feeling like the characters are so young and so immature and being frustrated by it. So that was kind of my one drawback. I did feel that immaturity. They did feel very young. But other than that, I liked the characters. I liked the story. If that doesn't bother you as much, or if you're younger than me, then I would highly recommend. The next book I finished in July was The Sanatorium by Sarah Pearse. And This one is a thriller where our main character is a detective who is going to a bridal shower for her brother at a hotel that used to be a sanatorium and was converted. And then they get trapped there and there's murder, and she has to put her detective hat on and catch the murderer before it's too late. And I had high hopes for this one. I thought it sounded like it would be an easy read and atmospheric, and I would enjoy trying to solve the mystery. But oh my god, was this not that? The main character is potentially one of the dumbest main characters I've read in a thriller in a long time, and she was supposed to be a detective. How was she ever hired as a detective? I do not know, because she is not good at her job and also has no common sense. And it was very frustrating trying to root for her while she just made all of the worst decisions and took so long to figure out what was going on. And then the clues she did find just were so out of left field and unbelievable that you were just left sitting there thinking, like, really? That was the clue? That's what we're going with? Okay. I also felt like the villain didn't make much sense, and there were one too many red herrings. I just started getting really annoyed. I also felt like the sanatorium part of it, the history of the building and what they tried to include there, just felt a little bit like trauma porn and felt a little in poor taste, because institutions like that have really existed and people have really been treated horrifically in facilities that are supposed to be helping them. And obviously I knew going into it that there was going to be a little bit of that sanatorium-inspired, like, thriller aspect. But I guess the description made it seem like it was just adding the atmosphere, like the creepy atmosphere, the fact that, yes, this is now a nice new modern hotel, but it used to be a sanatorium and we all know that. And so that makes it feel kind of creepy. And that the actual murders and the mystery were going to be unrelated to the history. And just the way it was tied in, I'm sure there was a way for it to be done that wouldn't have been so off-putting or felt like it was in such poor taste. But the way it was done just felt icky to me. And all the characters were annoying, and the ending made no sense whatsoever and was so annoying and made me really pissed off, actually. So I'm not going to get into it because I will rant and I can't say anything without spoiling it. But I would not recommend this book. I found it very annoying, not satisfying in the least, and not even that atmospheric either, which was the whole thing that I thought I was going to get from this. So yeah, sadly, this was 1 star. Just don't waste your time. The next book I finished in July was a much better experience, so that's good. And it was Perfect on Paper by Sophie Gonzales. This has kind of a similar setup to it as Cool for the Summer, with our main character being bisexual and having an interest in both a girl and a boy at their high school, and also struggling with biphobia and the fear that if they happen to choose a guy as a woman, that they won't be seen as bisexual anymore, that they won't feel like they belong within the LGBTQA plus community, that their identity will be erased, which is a big issue that bisexual people face. So I really enjoyed that whole aspect of this story, and I thought that was really well done. I also liked our main character and one of the love interests. The other one was not my favorite for reasons that I can't talk about because it spoils a big part of the book, but sadly, one of the 2 characters was not for me, but luckily I did like the main character and I did like one of the love interests, so I was able to kind of root for them and enjoy that part of the romance. And while I did like the build up to that romantic connection and the way it ends, I really struggled with the kind of gimmick of this book, which is that the main character is giving relationship advice anonymously to her peers. And the advice portions of the book really felt like they were not coming from a high school girl. And I realized that within the story, they kind of give the context that she is researching these things and she's watching YouTube videos and she's reading books. And so she's learning about this from older people and then passing that knowledge on. But it just felt like each time she was giving advice that it was like popping out of the narrative for the author to then directly give like self-help style love advice to the reader. And it was really jarring and felt quite awkward to read. The tone changed quite a bit each time the advice was being given. It felt like a 40-year-old man writing a blog post about how wives should act to make their husbands more happy or something. It was very strange. So I didn't love that aspect of it, and that was kind of like the big gimmick of the story. I also found the main character's sister, while I appreciated that she was a trans character and kind of brought that representation and that experience to the story, it wasn't explored too deeply. Like it was acknowledged that she was trans, and that came up a couple times. It wasn't deeply explored by any means, and she wasn't a point of view character, so you didn't really get too much of her experience or perspective. But her thing was that she was a YouTuber, which you would think that I would like as a YouTuber and kind of find fun. But I just found it really strange and forced, the way that her being a YouTuber fit into the story. And it just felt really cringy to me. And maybe just because I am a YouTuber, that it felt uncomfortable to see a character who was also a YouTuber. I don't know. That didn't work for me either. And I didn't love a lot of the secondary characters. Some of them made really awful decisions or did really bad things and then never really had any consequences, which was frustrating to read. And a lot of them just kind of felt one-dimensional and blank. Yeah, not a perfect read. I feel like I just really drove home the things I didn't like about it, but I did give it 4 stars. I did enjoy it quite a bit. I thought the main story was really sweet, and I liked it way more than Cool for the Summer, so I would definitely recommend this one over the other. But just know going into it that the main couple that end up together are very sweet, and you'll likely enjoy their story. But some of the other characters around it and the sort of gimmicky things of it might fall a little flat. So don't go in with super high expectations, but it was sweet. If you're looking for a quick, little fun, easy read, YA, bisexual representation, romance, this might be your thing. And finally, the last book I finished in July was our book club pick for July, which was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This beast of a book, the longest book that I read in July, comes to about 850 pages. This is a high fantasy standalone novel that explores the perspective of 4 point-of-view characters as they travel through continents and across seas, gearing up to the return of the Nameless One, a great and terrible dragon who is going to wake after 1,000 years of imprisonment within the abyss and wreak havoc upon humanity. So our 4 point-of-view characters are Iad, who is a handmaiden to the Queen of Innis, Queen Sabran, and she is keeping a really big secret. We have Tane, who is a young orphan who has trained her whole life to become a dragon rider. We have Niclai's Roos, who is an anatomist and an alchemist who betrayed Queen Sabran and has been exiled. And then we have Loth, who is a lord and heir to Goldenbirch, who is a close personal friend to the Queen of Innis, who has gone missing. And we follow these 4 characters as they travel around this world. They learn more about history and the basis of the various religious systems throughout their world. They pick up magical artifacts and learn about the root of magic within their world. They meet and ride dragons. They are kidnapped by pirates. There are plagues and mystical creatures and political intrigue. There's a lot going on here. There's also a central sapphic romance that just was so beautiful. Oh my God. I just love them so much. There's an asexual character. There is a relationship between 2 men in the past that was just really sweet in the way it was portrayed, really lovely. There's a lot of discussion about mortality and existence and quite a bit of talk about religion and how religion is formed, how myth fills in the gaps in the truth of history, and then can in turn become religion, and also how religion ties in with reproductive rights for those with uteruses. That's a really important portion of the story when it comes to Queen Sabran, who is one of a line of queens who all only have 1 child who is female, and that is how the line continues. And there's this really strong push, this duty, this expectation of Sabran to get pregnant and have a daughter and continue her line. But there's also this fear around this pregnancy and the feeling of replacing herself with her child and no longer having value as the figurehead of her country, of her religion, because there's a new, younger, fresher version of herself to kind of take over, and then she has no more worth or value within the society. And her grappling with that, of her own sense of worth and place and importance as an individual outside of her usefulness as a womb. And all of those discussions were so interesting. The world building is amazing. This world is wonderful. I'm really sad that it's a standalone. The magic system is really interesting. I don't want to tell you too much about it because I feel like the process of learning about the magic system within the book was one of my favorite parts of reading it, was kind of piecing it together. There are a lot of really interesting characters. Not only our 4 point of view characters, but there are many other really great characters in this story. And the relationships are amazing. Like, not only that central sapphic romance and the gay romance in the past, there's also some really lovely friendships in this story that are just as deep and meaningful as the romances. There are sibling relationships that are really special. There are relationships between humans and non-humans that are really lovely and deep and meaningful. It's just so good, y'all. You have to read it if you're a fantasy fan. Even if you're not, some of our book club members who don't typically read fantasy really enjoyed this. I think the lowest rating anyone gave this book was 4 stars, if I'm remembering correctly. So this was a huge hit, even amongst people who don't normally read fantasy or high fantasy. You can definitely feel that this was written by a woman in a good way. There are just so many complex, interesting, varied female characters in the story, as well as lovely male characters. But we all know sometimes in high fantasy, you have to sacrifice complex female characters that actually feel like real human beings for the rest of the story, because apparently it's really hard to write women as people, I guess. But that is not a problem here. So many amazing female characters and characters of all genders. Really enjoyed this book, and I'm definitely going to reread it and also read everything else that Samantha Shannon has ever written, because this was amazing. Oh, and one more thing. This is definitely a high fantasy that sort of culminates in a huge battle. But I will say the battle does not span 5 million chapters. It doesn't go on for too long. It is quite a succinct epic battle, which I appreciated. And it was not overly graphic or violent, which is something that I really struggle with. I just don't really care about wars and battles. I don't love reading about them. So any book that spends too much time on a battle or gets too in the weeds with strategy or gets too graphic with violence, I just kind of check out. It's not interesting to me. And this did not do that, which I appreciated. I will say it maybe went a little too far in the other direction, where the final climax, the epic battle, maybe felt like it went by a little too quickly, or it was a little too easy. It definitely didn't ruin my enjoyment of the book by any means, but I totally could have seen this split into a duology so that it could have had a little bit more time for that conclusion to really have a bit more impact, hopefully without it being too battle heavy. The pacing does speed up a little bit at the end, and that was something that was kind of a consensus amongst us in the book club discussing it, that we did feel like the ending could have been given a little bit more space to breathe, but we also kind of generally agreed that we liked that the battle didn't go on for forever and wasn't super graphic or unnecessarily complicated. So anyways, I'm going to stop talking about this book because I could probably fill a whole other video with me just rambling on about various threads of things that I found very cool about it. I also can't talk nearly as much in depth as I would like to because I don't want to spoil anybody who wants to read it, and I really feel like you probably should read this. So yes, The Priory of the Orange Tree, last book of July. Such a good way to end it. 5 stars for sure. Loved it. And that's it. Those are all the books that I read in June and July. 14 books total, and then 1 DNF. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was really nice being back talking about books with you again. Of course, please let me know in the comments down below what you're currently reading, your favorite books recently, recommendations. If you've read any of the books that I talked about, I really want to know your impressions. Do you agree with me? Do you completely disagree with me? Let's have a discussion. That is one of my favorite parts about these videos, is chatting about books in the comments. And yeah, Thank you again to Ana Luisa for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use the link in the description box to shop their summer sale and get 20% off your purchase. I want to take a moment to thank my patrons for their support before I go. Extra special thanks to our newest patrons: Carrie, Fatma, Diana, Marta, Annie, Catherine, Sabina, Aaron, Robert, Julia, Kelly, Phoenix, Nina, Sunshine, Jessica, and Iskra. Welcome all of you to the squad. We are so excited to have you. If you at home want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. And with that, I'm gonna get going. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.